Hello and welcome to NIGP's Learning Lab. Today's session is Use Meaningful Measures of Merit, hosted by Richard Pennington with special guest Paul Brennan. Richard has over 35 years of experience in public procurement law and leadership in the U.S. Air Force and state government, 7 years of which was in private law practice. He helps in development and facilitation of NIGP's Pathways courses. Richard is co-author of the third edition of Legal Aspects of Public Procurement and author of Seeing Excellence, Learning from Great Procurement Teams. Richard, would you like to get us started?
So welcome to Meaningful Measures of Merit. And what we're trying to do today is help you evaluate kind of proposed measures in a variety of different situations that you're using. Like we'll talk about balanced scorecard and be able to assess their effectiveness. Show you the importance of using stakeholders to kind of validate measures of effectiveness and cost savings. That's probably one of the two through lines here is use your stakeholders. Assess the utility of numerical measures and RFP evaluations. We'll touch on that, give you some resources for additional learning. Critically evaluate surveys and for potential areas and use those. And then would like you to go away with knowing the difference between correlation and causation, which is something you'll hear a lot of among business professionals, statisticians, but it's something we probably need to know also when we're working on these projects. I've got a great guest today. Paul Brennan is the purchasing director of the county of Rockland, New York. He also is the president of a company he's established known as ProcurePath. We'll talk about that here in just a little bit in terms of what Paul does. He's a past president of NIGP and also the 2016 recipient of the penultimate award in NIGP, the Albert Hall Memorial Award. So welcome, Paul. Feel free to let us look and give us a wave. So we're looking forward to learning from you. So, hey.
Good afternoon, everyone. Glad to be here and looking forward to an exciting session.
Yeah. Thanks. A lot of, and we've got a lot of content here, chock pretty full, and I hope you all can learn from this. You know, my first story, and the reason I've got this is the first story when I was writing the book and started this in 2010. I was watching a presentation with the National Association of State Procurement Officials called NASPO, and they were talking about or allowing a winner of what they called the Cronin Award to talk about the projects. And there was a young new professional about just a few years out of college named Thomas Lindley, who had come into a new job in the state office, and he was put in charge of the cost per copy contracts. And as he went out and visited the clients, he learned that there was a lot of frustration. A couple things. One was they had to get different maintenance manuals for the different kinds of machines. That was a source of some frustration. They had to have training, you know, and I remember these days, all these newfangled machines were coming in like fax machines and printers and scanners and the rest of that. And you kind of had to learn each one different. And of course there was fear also because people didn't want their printer to go away. I suffered through that myself. Didn't want anybody taking my printer that was connected to my computer, but he convinced his boss to run a pilot with this department and one political subdivision, local government that was in the Columbus, Ohio area, just to see. And what I've got here is the executive summary that Thomas used to measure what the effects were of the pilot performance. They ended up saving in a year span around 180,000. They reduced the copy machines or the office machines from about 49 down to 12, had a big reduction in the costs per copy that they were paying as a result of this initiative, and their monthly costs went way down. And they ended up adopting. He was able to convince people essentially that this was a good thing, and people were happy with the service, happy with what they got, and really happy with the fact that they didn't have to learn so many different things. They were using copy machines. It's an example of what how we use measures for decision making, and which gets us back really to the purpose of measurement. Which I love this quote by Douglas Hubbard, and I've used him in chapter 6, that the outcome of a decision, if it's questionable or uncertain and has significant consequences, then measurements reduce uncertainty about it. And that has high value. And I think that's the second through line. One is the importance of stakeholders, and the other one is keeping the purpose of measurement in mind. If you are reducing uncertainty in decisions, then it's got value. Now we're going to talk about precision and accuracy and some of those things, but that to me is the touchstone. So anything we talk about for the next couple hours, please keep that in mind. You know, I've got on this slide, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but let me just run through what chapter 6 will say. And some of these things you've probably heard in your experience, like an input measure. You know, a requisition coming in is an input into a process. A solicitation that's issued and a contract signed would be an output measure, showing the process measure and how much work you're doing. An outcome measure is down the road a little farther, and it looks at really effectiveness. What are you achieving, or efficiency? Are you saving money, which commonly we think in terms of our activities in procurement as outcomes, trying to measure those, and sometimes they're the hardest ones to measure. Indicators or metrics come into two categories generally, leading and lagging. If you're trying to look at what your solicitation workload is going to be in a year, having some way to track the number of requisitions is often a leading indicator in terms of later workload and solicitations. Lagging indicators, sometimes, I mean, customer satisfaction is one of those. Sometimes that lags some kinds of changes that have occurred prior to the measurement, especially when you're only measuring, let's say, quarterly or semi-annually, that has happened early. Accuracy and precision are two related but a little bit different concepts. We'll talk about that in particular when you get down to RFP evaluations, chat with that. And then last two things are biggies is variation. You know, we often average, but over time, often the best indicator of how you are effective in terms of effectiveness is how things are changing and whether or not there's a reasonable amount of stability, whether your processes are what we kind of call in control, or whether you're all over the place in terms of what your outputs are, maybe your outcomes are. We call that variation, that I believe is probably more important. And it is in manufacturing too. If you look at manufacturing metrics, they're trying to see how things are changing. That's the variation issue. And then sampling is a concept that we'll talk about a little bit more on surveying. We don't typically really sample, and I'll explain why a little bit, but sampling just means you're taking a representative portion of a whole universe of data, measuring it, and then drawing conclusions about attributes from that representative sample. That's sampling. What we've kind of come down to, I think now in the last probably 20 years, is the importance of having a balanced approach to measurement. You know, companies, and still do in large measure, but for a long time, commercial entities, all they did was measure price, or I'm sorry, revenues. They measured financial performance, and they forgot about the other things that really went into strategy and successful organizational performance. You're going to see evidence of that today with people here on the call, notably Paul, and we've got some others that are doing some of this. One of these is this slide. Bill Kerr is on our call today. Bill is the purchasing manager for the county of Washington, Wisconsin. He responded to one of my Insight kind of promotional posts, sent me some material. We exchanged emails about what they're doing on cost avoidance, which really is an outcome measure. And I like this. It illustrates early on in the presentation a few things. One is the importance of trying to nail down definitions for things. And what I like is when Bill displays this, he's got the definitions of cost avoidance and how he's computed this right on on the measures that he displays. I took this as 2 columns out of a 3-column presentation just so we could see it. He also tracks total spend. And so total award values are in the neighborhood of over $7 million when he gets these percentage. This is really a nice presentation. Another good thing about it is it's tracking over time. The nice thing about a consistent, sort of well-defined standard for measurement is now you can start seeing trends. And this is telling me, for a senior executive, if I was one, he's doing a nice job. He's not only holding his own, but in terms of the percentage of cost avoidance, the way they measure it for the projects they bid, they're improving. Out of Paul's materials, and I've got some cites to Paul's seminar materials, which he's shared with me. They're terrific, by the way. We'll talk about that in a few minutes when Paul and I chat. But this came out of the International Public Procurement Conference. This image that Paul uses and cites to in his seminar materials on performance management. I like it because it really shows the importance of these 4 attributes: customer, financial, business process measurement, learning and growth, to the overall importance of organizational excellence. And so the vision and the strategy of the organization are in the middle, but the measurements really inform our outlook about how organizations do in these 4 dimensions that we call balanced scorecards, with really some of the attendant questions that go with that on the outside, like, how do the customers see us? Are we surveying? What do we need to excel at from a process perspective, and also from a cost perspective? That's up there, and we measure those things and try to come up with outcome measurements that illustrate that. Where can we create value in our people, for example, with learning and growth measures, and which I've always found to be one of the hardest things to measure? How do you measure learning and growth? Well, we use process measures often for that, in terms of perhaps where we're sending people to training, how much training we're doing. One of the best outcome measures, I still think, is certifications. Some entities actually measure their progress on achieving professional certifications like CPP, CPO, CPPB, those types of things. And then, are we doing the best for our stakeholders? That's a big part of a question that really touches both customer satisfaction and how we measure that, and again, learning and growth for the people that work for us. Balanced scorecard. I think it's a central concept. This is also from Paul's seminar materials. Paul is still doing this, by the way, when he has all his spare time, as he has. And I'm going to just stop here in just a second and let him kind of comment on this. But he has in his material some ideas for some of these in the customer, financial, learning and growth, internal business processes. I met Paul on the financial side when I saw what he was doing with cost savings, and we're going to hear more about that in a little bit. You saw Bill Kerr's got metrics on financial. Some ideas on customer. How about complaints? How about internal customer satisfaction, which is probably one of the most widely used measures that's around. Some of the supplier satisfaction. I never measured that. Except when we were making a decision on whether to execute an e-procurement system that I call my successful failure back about 25 years ago or so. We did measure we did survey supplier satisfaction with the system to determine whether to go ahead. But overall, I didn't do that. And then internal business processes. What about our numbers of suppliers? Some things there to think about in terms of those types of measures. I'll just stop there a little bit before we go into breakout, Paul, and just ask you first to correct my work if I did anything wrong. But how do you find these breakouts valuable? I'm just curious. these. Those four things, is that something you do focus on, or you try to?
Yes, we focus on these, and it's all part of our balanced scorecard. We feel these are the four areas that any procurement organization should be concentrating on. Certainly, what how your customer feels about procurement is key for them coming to you. So you can, hopefully be the organization that helps them get what they want, as opposed to them feeling the need to go around you and avoid you. Internal business processes are a big thing that procurement offers our customers. We need to continually review our business processes to make sure they're customer friendly and they're building in efficiencies to the procurement process, whether it's the use of P cards, whether it's the use of online catalogs in your ePro system so you can speed the purchase order generation process. All different types of internal business processes can increase the efficiency of both the procurement organization, but also your internal customers as well. And then the financial end of it's very important, measuring cost savings and cost avoidance. Cost avoidance is probably, we generate more cost avoidance on an annual basis than actual cost savings. But we need to be able to show that procurement does play a vital role and that cost avoidance is a very important metric to measure. And then learning and growth is very important. You talked about certification, but procurement's always changing, and we need to be able to show that we're continuing to train and develop our people.
I'd like you to hold the thought, Paul, about which one of these have you had the hardest time measuring? And we'll talk about that on the other side of the break when we chat a little bit in terms of the measurement aspects of a lot of these things. And with that, I think what we're going to do is go ahead and go on into a break. Let me just show you before we do what the material is. If you want to get your hands on the Word document that I emailed you, I'm going to just pop that up here into the, you'll see the first activity we're going to talk about as breakout. So what I'd like you to share in your experience as you go into these, what are you using? Pick one that is a measure that you use in your procurement organization and characterize it. When I described input or output, leading, lagging, is it an outcome that shows efficiency and effectiveness, really measures that? Is it like cost savings is one, and customer satisfaction is one, but there may be others. What are you tracking? And share your experiences with that. Remember, I promised Paul he didn't have to do the talking. So what?
I kind of took the lead.
Oh, okay. Well, that's okay if you volunteer. I just don't want you to be conscripted. So okay. That's okay. Yeah.
We talked about, I think everybody's trying to do, a little bit. Some people are, trying to get off the ground with this. Customer satisfaction was discussed, pretty in detail about, determining our customer satisfaction levels. One organization does an email survey, routinely, no set schedule, but they do it routinely. And talked a little bit about the challenge of putting a contract in place, but then your end users can go out and find it online for $20 cheaper or $15 cheaper, and trying to deal with those issues within the customer satisfaction realm and so forth. Also talked a little bit about the difficulty in finding the data in order to be able to track stuff. And some are looking to measure the timeline from when they get a request through solicitation, so they have those type of benchmark data on how long it takes to generate and go through the solicitation process.
One, we're sort of all in it together. It was not just my organization that's struggling, but that you just have to choose a start point, which I appreciated.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it sounded like we were all, had some basic measures, a number of RFQs, number of, or, requests for quotes or RFPs or bids, and, whether they're I know on our end, we do formal versus informal, and we track purchase order numbers and dollar values, that kind of thing. But, we don't do all these other, more detailed stuff that you have in this scorecard here.
Yeah, and really what you're describing are process measures, either inputs or outputs, not necessarily outcomes or effectiveness or efficiencies, which is where Bill is good, because he's got a pretty good what I call an outcome measure, right? And that's what is that, Bill? What's your outcome measure that we showed?
Right, that's the cost avoidance that we're trying to demonstrate by the value or impact of doing competitive bidding has on the pricing that we pay. And I'd also like to add to what we were talking about is that these things just don't happen overnight either. It's all work in progress, that it does take some time and research to develop something into what is helpful for your entity over time.
Yeah, great points. I've got this as actually a report that Paul does as one of his reports to the senior executives. This is filled with process measures, along with his, we'll talk about a little bit more, his cost avoidance and his financial measures, but this has got common ones in it. Requisitions approved. That's going to be a leading indicator on workload. Purchase orders and contracts issued. That's going to be a leading indicator on contract administration. If you do that, if you administer them yourself, maybe not as big a hit. Total P-card transactions, P-card dollar values, another common measures that people do that. Now you do have to balance, as Melissa brought this up, you got finite amount of time and you can't do it all often. And so what you're trying to do is set some criteria here to help you make judgments in terms of, what's most important. I'm going to just give you a couple I used in division. This has been now, wow, 20 years ago almost, but we used to track cycle times, and at state level. This was a 4-year, this is my final division briefing actually, when I was showing what we were doing from a contract cycle time. We were heavily bureaucratic on contract improvements. And interestingly, once we got into this, we found out that the reason that we were having customer service issues was largely a function of the time it took us to, as central approvers, to route the contracts and get them through. These were the numbers of days, and showed over 4 years. Then we broke it down into data that we had off of our financial system in terms of where it was, and the error rate. We coded in error rates for people. When we sent them back because something was screwed up, it stopped our clock. We sent it back, and we were able to track those percentages of errors, how long it was taken in the agencies, and central approvers. I was one. I was an attorney. I did legal reviews of about 3,000 contracts a year. And then we had the state controller was the one on the top that did the final approval after my legal review. We had perverse incentives. And you've probably seen this happen. If the clock is stopped when there's an error, people figured out on the central approvers that if you found an error and sent it back, the clock stopped. And instead of finding all the errors and sending it back once, sometimes there was a successive number of returns and reworks that worked really as a perverse incentive on the system. And we talked about that. And this helped us understand what we were seeing. And we had to ask each of ourselves, when I'm a lawyer, do I just find the first thing that's wrong? I usually could figure out what it was, like no insurance certificate or something like that under the rules, send it back. Instead of going through and saying it's got a problem with the insurance certificate, I'm real unclear of the authority of the person that won it. That's the way you do it so you don't waste people's time. And that can be a perverse incentive when you're measuring things like this. But we were able to use it and try to assess why it was we had lousy customer service rates. The issue of causation and correlation went like this. we could almost track our division-wide customer service rating by the amount of time it took in the contract cycle. And so we thought that what was causing our bad customer service ratings was the contract approval. And when we went in and did this display, we realized that the agencies were hanging on to this internally longer than we were. And so it wasn't really clear that the whole reason we were suffering from customer satisfaction was that it was our fault. Many times the agencies were hanging on it. Now, were they hanging on it because we were so nitpicking, we were sending stuff back at every time there was a little problem? Maybe. We talked about that too, but that's an example of the causation and correlation. There was a correlation between customer service and the contract routing time, but not necessarily one causing the other. You had to check for independent reasons. We also did what you probably do. I identified cycle times for the various types of things. The publication of the DQ, documented quote, the time for evaluation, it was quite short, and then the agency internal and then the central approvers. And DQs there really wasn't one. I mean, that was a small purchase that there was no central approval of that. We delegated that out, but you can see how the times kind of grew. Now, we're going to talk now the conversation that Paul and I had, which is a great one, by the way. I always tell people getting ready for these is the fun part for me. And so I'm going to just stop to share a little bit with Paul and ask you, you have a definite opinion about measuring cycle times, Paul. What is that?
Well, I mean, it's certainly cycle time for solicitation to award is something that we're interested in tracking. I think that can be tracked a little bit more objectively than requisition to purchase order time. But I think it's a good measure to look at, to make sure you're making the solicitation process and the review process, evaluation process, and the award process as efficient as possible. Certainly, it's going to be when you look at it, if you're going to take it down a notch to actually look at it per buyer level, you have to be very careful, because depending upon the type of commodities that a buyer is assigned, certainly their solicitation cycle time may be greater than another buyer, just because of the complexity of what's being purchased. So you can't necessarily compare buyer against buyer, depending upon what commodities they're buying. But it's a good benchmark to have to compare from year to year and so forth. Same thing with requisition of purchase order cycle time. Certainly that's data that you can normally get out of whatever ERP system that you have. And it's really just a reporting that you have to work with IT to develop the reporting. But once it's done, you just run it once a month. So, the little bit of work up front, and then you can easily get that data on a regular basis. But again, you have to take into consideration the complexity of what's being purchased by each buyer. So it's very difficult to compare from a buyer to buyer level different purchase order cycle times. We use it mainly as a goal for each buyer to continually try to improve their own cycle time to make it as efficient as possible, not really comparing one buyer against the other or ranking the buyers based upon cycle time, because that wouldn't be accurate and really wouldn't be fair. Because again, depending upon what they buy, there's going to be a lot of variables that will affect the cycle time.
Yeah, and I like what you said there, because there is a tendency to try to grab these numbers and bring in false accuracy and precision into rating people. And I think you've got to look on this as a system measurement, not necessarily individual measurements. And so we kind of left aside individual performance measurement here. I mean, a lot of these concepts still apply, but I like your skepticism, really, and I think that's excellent. I've already mentioned a couple times your seminar, and I wanted to let people see this. It's one that you've done under your Procure Path sort of moniker on understanding and implementing procurement performance measurements and KPIs, which are key performance indicators. What actually caused you to, what led you to do that? I'm just curious.
Well, we implemented a program, starting probably 8 years ago, and continually refine it. In my full-time job at Rockland County, but I do a lot of training, some of it for NIGP, others directly for NIGP chapters, and I kept on getting asked to do conference sessions on performance measurements. And then the New York chapter actually asked me if I could do a one-day class. So this is when we developed it's a full one-day class. Really, brings an introduction to what they are and how to look at them. So if someone doesn't have a full understanding, the first half of the class is really going to give you a good understanding of the what, why, and how of procurement performance measurements. And then the second half of the class, we look at, well, how do you take the next steps and implement such a class, and give you 5 what we feel are the essential procurement metrics that everybody should be tracking, and you can kind of start with those 5. But we really started based upon some requests from NIGP chapters. So we were always available to give the seminar to any organization, and we certainly can do it virtually now as well.
Yeah. I'm going to just show another slide here real quick about something I took out of your manual there about the 4 elements of performance management that, so I've talked about balanced scorecard and the attributes, the customer focus, financial, process, and learning and growth. But those are all used to inform how you're doing in terms of your performance and managing that. So are these the 4 things that you really look at for your measurement system to sort of influence or help you manage? Is that what this is for?
Yeah, I mean, when you're going to sit down and try to develop a performance management program, you really need to start with some strategic planning. Understand, what are you trying to report on? What's important to your elected officials? That's really one of the first things to ask is what's important to your supervisors and your elected officials, because that may be totally different than what's important to the procurement organization. And certainly that's who we want to report to. So it's important to do some strategic planning and understand what's important to the elected officials as well as your internal customers. Then you need to develop an implementation plan and actually implement the performance measurements. And then you want to monitor your progress as you go on, and then identify opportunities for improvement. Depending upon your organization, depending upon your technical ability to get data, you're going to try to implement metrics that work, and you're going to try to implement metrics that end up not working for your organization. So once you put some type of performance measurement plan in place, you're always going to be changing it and updating based upon what works. If you find a particular metric, either you can't get accurate data and you're not confident in it, or maybe nobody cares about it, there's no sense in continuing the effort on that particular metric. So you're always going to look to opportunities to improve the program.
Cool. And you and I first met, and this is 9 years ago, I think, or maybe 8 years ago, when I was writing a book and talking with you about Chapter 6, and I'd seen what you were doing on cost avoidance. And actually, as I recall, you've got some awards for that, that whole revenue and cost avoidance model. And yes. And how long have you been doing that? I'm just curious, the measurement of the cost avoidance that way.
We've been doing it at least, I believe, 12 years now.
Okay.
So we've actually developed our own software internally that we use to track cost avoidance, cost savings, and about other 6 or 7 other categories that could be efficiencies or other methods of saving money. Um, and, the buyers have that right on their desktop. So, as they process transactions and either identify cost savings, cost avoidance, or one of the other categories, um, they can just, click on, open up the database, put that information in, and then I can run reports on a monthly basis. We do audit it to make sure that we feel that what the buyer put in is correct and actual cost savings or cost avoidance. So we do have an audit of the data that goes into that database. You want to make sure people have a level of comfort of what you're reporting, is accurate.
Now, when I had you and I had spoken, you talked about um, what you keep internally for management for data, and then what you actually report up to leadership. And you don't send it all up. You actually provide monthly activity reports that have a bunch of data. And I noticed that many of those are process input, kind of output measures, not necessarily outcome measures. I think I showed one slide there that had requisition volumes and various things like that. Why are those important? The process measures showing your activity.
I mean, those are important because it shows the volume of what goes through the average public procurement organization. Most elected officials or senior executives really have no idea in terms of the volume of what comes through the centralized procurement function. Um, and you showed the data that just had numbers, but we actually list in detail um, every solicitation that was issued during the month, every solicitation that was opened during the month, every solicitation that was awarded during the month. And we feel that's very key because procurement's always got their hands in many different projects, all at different stages of the project, from issuing the solicitation, opening them, evaluating them, and awarding them. And once we started doing that on a monthly basis, we got calls from senior staff in the executive's office saying, geez, we never knew that so much went on every month in terms of issuing, awarding, renewing contracts, and so forth. So it really opened up their eyes on how much we do with limited staffing, and actually helped me get greater support for adding staff over the past couple of years by being able to show everything that's going on a monthly basis.
Yeah, and it's funny because in breakout group 2, Melissa had brought up, she even, I think, almost quoted that, what you said, they often just don't know what we do. One of the things
No,
is it's a way.
they think we buy
Yeah.
paper clips and copy paper.
Yeah, and in retrospect, when I went back, I realized that it wasn't necessarily meaningful in terms of what our outcome performance was, but it sure was having a dialogue about the kinds of mission we had and what we did to support the department. And that's important. I mean, and that's something you can do. A lot of us track the numbers, and just even starting with numbers lets people start asking questions about, now what is the difference between an RP and, why does this matter? And you can talk with them about that. So, I mean, I think that's a great insight.
Yeah. And one of the things else we also include in that report, which is actually comes before a lot of the data, is significant accomplishments during the month. So that's where the outcomes,
Yeah.
and we put that right up front and forward in the report. So whether it was significant cost savings or cost avoidance that was achieved, um, um, we're very big at shared service in the county. So I provide procurement services to a lot of villages and towns. And that's important to my county executive. So we make sure we identify all the accomplishments in terms of shared services and working with the other jurisdictions. Training is a big thing that our office does to our end users. So we certainly highlight any training that's provided during the month. So it's important to kind of summarize those accomplishments into one short bulleted paragraph. And we make sure they get that on a monthly basis.
And then the other question that's kind of led to for me was you had mentioned the need to find out what's important to leadership, whether that's your supervisor, whether it's the executive level. And I know you track lots of measures, but you don't necessarily report all of them. You have what you call the big five. What were the big five when you mentioned that to me? Curious.
Right. The big five are cost savings, cost avoidance, okay, procurement ROI, and this is something that very few procurement organizations do. Procurement ROI is taking a look at what the cost of your procurement organization is. So that's your total budgeted cost, all your salaries, your benefits, all your supplies, your service contract. What's the cost of operating the procurement department compared to the cost of savings, cost avoidance, and revenues? So certain departments, like I have revenue contracts that I manage, vending, and a
Yeah.
number of other ones. So, I manage that contract. I want the revenue on my budget. Um, but we actually develop a profit and loss statement each year, which shows the return on investment of the procurement function. And that's something that elected officials understand. Most of them are business people or attorneys, and they understand profit and loss. So it's taking all your costs, and that's one of the things that's always lacking when public procurement people talk about cost savings and how much they save their organization. They never deduct out what the cost of operating the procurement function is. So
Yeah.
you really need to do that. And then the other two are spend under management. So, what's the percentage of spend that's not going through procurement? All right, that's either maverick spend or it may be decentralized depending upon your organization. But how much spend doesn't go through procurement? And then the last one is spend under contract. How much of your spend are you issuing against either a contract that you awarded, a state contract, a cooperative contract, the GSA contract? What's that total? And certainly those are numbers that you want to continually increase your spend under management, and you want to continually increase your spend under contract.
I did ask you to hold a thought. I'd ask you now, of those four balance measures, learning and growth, customers, process, cost, you've got the cost pretty much nailed. Of the other balanced measures, what did you find the most challenging to actually quantify in any way? Curious.
Well, the growth was probably the most difficult, and I think a lot of procurement organizations, find difficulty in that area because obtaining money for training is always very difficult. So, in order to get that growth and train your employees, it does take a financial commitment by the organization. But that too has improved over time, based upon all these other metrics that I've been reporting, because again, our return on investment is recognized, for the organization. So we're able to get more money now for training and certification, of our employees to make sure they're all trained as best as they can be. But that
Great.
was probably the biggest challenge, just because of the monetary issue.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Paul. Appreciate that. I wanted to catch up on a couple chats. One was Latifa had mentioned when I asked for the definition of measurement that the purpose of that, or the purpose of measurement, is to understand patterns. And I think we're going to dive into that now a little bit more with surveys and the mechanics of measurement a little bit. I did notice Bill had a great insight. He'd always understood you can't improve what you don't measure. And in many ways, I think that probably is true. I mean, you need to have some kind of an objective assessment of where you are in order to get to an improvement and identify that, especially if senior people are making decisions based on your improvement. And I found the same thing that Paul had said, that even having process measures is a way to help convince senior people, especially that control the budget, that you're undergoing growth and in terms of workload, and you just can't do it with the current current staff. So great questions and great insight by both of you on that. One other thing on this slide I wanted to just talk about is it's important to have common definitions. There's something called operational definitions in the science of metrology, which is actually, there's a whole discipline on measurement, but you need to have a common definition on things like cost savings, cost avoidance, when you start talking to senior people and among yourselves. There is a philosophical discussion a little bit about where the difference is between cost savings and cost avoidance. I like the definition Paul has here. If Bill Kerr, I think, has done this, if you go out and negotiate an RFP, or you award based on a bid, a competitive bid, and the bid amount or the award amount is less than like the average, as long as your stakeholders kind of buy into the way you're measuring, that is an indication of what you're avoiding in terms of future costs, because you're here, your competitive process and negotiating. If you go at the end of a year and you're thinking about an option and you've got unit pricing on a blanket purchase order, for example, and you can negotiate down the costs or the unit costs under a contract prior to option exercise, that's probably put in the cost savings block, because you're actually reducing the cost through what you're contractually obligated to do already. So a couple ideas there in terms of at least getting the glossary of terms right. And I would point you to chapter 6, Paul's stories in there, and especially the revenue piece, the return on investment concept is in the summary there in chapter 6 of the book. So it's got to be objective. Try to find data that you can get your hands on that you can reasonably tout as objective when you're doing the measurement. Financial systems, ideally, ways that have attracted, and that's why probably learning and growth is so hard, because we can track how many hours people go training, but figuring out what their return is or what their improvement is as a result of the training is an issue, not just for you all, but in the training side. I know we talk about this in NIGP all the time in terms of, how do you measure actual outcomes? And are people actually showing behaviors that are mattering at work? It's hard. And then finally, stakeholder acceptance. This is, I've heard it a couple times now. And, if you're trying to influence decisions with measurement so that you've got key decisions that are being made, maybe not made by you, you may be making decisions using internal data, but you're trying to advocate or influence other people to perhaps give you additional employees, staff. When you give them measures, the stakeholders have to accept it. And so it takes a little bit of an education process to do that. I found that finding a handful of stakeholders to test a survey design, for example, get feedback, is a way not just to test the accuracy of what you're measuring, but to start to get stakeholders involved in what you're doing and a potential adoption of that. And one of the things I liked about the story of Paul that I told in the book is he really heavily involved the auditing people. He had people looking at what he was doing so that the other staff that can be skeptical sometimes, especially when you're competing for resources, weren't necessarily going to come back and say, well, I see what you're measuring, but it's all bogus, Paul. I mean, he didn't appear to have that. I've seen that happen before when you're not involving your stakeholders and your leadership in the development of the measures so they're accepted.
Rich?
Go ahead, yeah.
We actually took it even further step. We formalized it in an MOU between the purchasing division and the finance department and the finance commissioner, that these are the definitions of how we're going to measure and track. And they signed off that they agreed that these were all measurable and reportable.
Good. Yeah. And that was my experience too, a little, Paul. When I was with Colorado, we had something called performance-based budgeting. And that was my chance to elevate the metrics I thought were objective and really meaningful up through our CFO in the department that went up to the governor's office. And once you get that, you've got buy-in, and it was really useful in trying to advocate for staff changes, which I was able to do like you did at one point. And then finally, be honest with measures. I'm going to talk about that here in a little story with another entity. So customer satisfaction. Let's talk about that. This is one that we actually used over 3 years. A little hard to see the other years, but it showed the fiscal year 2004, which is the fiscal year before I retired out of Colorado. The numbers of excellence, goods, fairs, needs improvement, and poors. And one thing we saw here was it was an interesting dip in the middle. We had lots of people that loved us, quite a few that really didn't like us at all, and nobody in the middle that. And so we talked about that as a division about what that was sending us. It was unlike the previous years that were a little bit more of a normal distribution and customer satisfaction. That was kind of related, I think, to kind of how we were doing surveys. We learned about surveys was we weren't really sampling. I mean, we had a finite level of people. We didn't have 1 million people like they do in the polls, political polls, that we were going in and sampling using 175 randomly selected people, in the universe. We knew who our customers were, and what we were trying to do was to get everybody. So we weren't doing sampling techniques. We were looking at a universe of the data. And sometimes you've got to take some of the sampling science a little bit and be a little careful about how that's applied. But there are issues with it. One is self-selection, for example. We would go out, we wouldn't hound people, and usually the ones we sort of suspected that was borne out by that slide were the ones that really loved us or the ones that kind of hated us. And we didn't always get the people, inside. And we talked about that at an executive level. And I was upfront about it because it's a problem that everybody solves, but we still found the survey results useful to portray how people felt about us as a division. Try to use anonymity. That's a way to promote more participation. We and I think you can do it now a lot easier using SurveyMonkey, having somebody outside of you as a purchasing manager, maybe somebody else in the department, like in finance, actually take in the survey response. Having these emailed to somebody that was not in procurement, for example, to help assemble that. And it encouraged really more participation because they didn't feel like they were going to get poisoned by somebody rejecting their contracts for nitnoy stuff if they were honest. And we saw that work. You want consistency in your definitions and how you do this over time. If you're changing them every year, it's hard to get a common comparison apples to apples over time. So you try to not change too much on the surveys all the time, try to hang on to them. I think Paul's done that. It looked like Bill's done that. And we try to do that in our surveys or customer satisfaction surveys. We've talked a little about correlation and causation. Be careful about drawing causal relationships just because the numbers seem to match up in trends. That's a correlation function in statistics, but unless you can establish that there's no other independent reasons for the correlation, you can't really necessarily say that one causes the other. Some people adjust for outliers, like take out an outlier was really skewing your mathematics. And then finally, don't let them be too long. I think I've heard if they can't finish it in 10 minutes, they're probably not going to be too interested. Try to keep the surveys not too long. And then finally, on the other side, there are some design errors you want to at least be critical about when you're looking at your surveys. One is don't have multiple dimensions on a single question. I used somebody in the Department of Human Services who had survey science training to look at our surveys. And this was the feedback they gave me. You're asking things about 3 different types of things like timeliness, your communication skills in a single question. We did some adjustments because of that in a single question. Compound questions. Be careful about the use of the or and the word and, because that starts to confuse people about whether you've got to achieve both of them or just one of them. have somebody, and it's good to have somebody looking at this that is not familiar necessarily with your business. That's why I had recommended earlier, find a select group of people that will look at it and kind of give you feedback. Careful about ambiguous terms. That means define them, like things like cost savings, cost avoidance, those operational definitions. We're going to talk about that a little bit here in evaluations. Careful about leading questions. It's true, isn't it, that we're probably one of the better offices you've ever been around procurement-wise, right? I mean, that's a typical lawyer leading question, but it's suggesting the answer kind of skews what your what your results are going to be on the common scales that you use on customer service. And then finally, reverse bias means be careful and be clear when you start talking and using survey questions that start out as, do you agree or disagree with this? And then you switch to a negative. It says, no, you're not timely, or you are timely. Careful about reverse bias questions. You've got to be real prominent on the face of the survey for that. The story here, and I just wanted to show you another example. This came out of, and this is used in the book too, meaningful measures at the Dallas area rapid transportation. Connie Arrington and the gentleman next to him are both analysts, and had come up with balanced measures. And I got a couple here. One was they were using contracts awarded each month, so you get a feel for what their workload was, and then they were measuring customer satisfaction and tracking what the various categories were of the satisfaction indexes. But the best part of this was the quote that introduced one of my other slides, and I love this. One is, Jason says, you've got to be honest, about how you present the data. I mean, if you've built credibility with stakeholders and that you think you've developed trust, if they find out that you're really not being honest with the presentation, and this really happens in customer survey satisfaction surveys, you're gonna lose credibility quick. And so you've got to be honest. And then the second thing that Connie said was, if your people are taking the time to fill these things out, let them know the results. I don't know how many times I filled out and then it goes into the black hole, and I never hear how people, how we did, or how the office that was doing the survey did. So when you're using meaningful measures, be honest and give feedback. Well, let's move on then to the last kind of major category, and then we'll do a breakout so we can share some ideas on this. And that's going to be numerical evaluations. I call it the question of utility of numerical evaluations and RFPs. And this quote here came out of a court decision. If you ever take my legal aspects class, we talk about this a little bit in the RFP section, where what had happened on the Serco case is the United States Department of General Services Administration had put out a solicitation for multiple awards on some IT system awards. They had hundreds of people propose. They were going to do over 20 awards for a national contract, and they rated these using adjective ratings. Some of you may do that. Outstanding, excellent, good, fair, poor is one example of a kind of a 5-point rating. Then after the adjectives were done by the evaluation committee team, they turned all that into new numbers. And the numbers, they averaged out to the thousandths, 3 decimal points precision, they thought. And they drew a line between two that had less than like a 0.1% difference on the multiple awards. And the ones below that line, obviously the ones below the line, then multiple ones protested. And they say, this just doesn't make sense the way you've done this. And the court agreed. And they said, you've attached talismanic significance to technical calculations that really suffer from false provision or precision. So I often say, spreadsheets don't make decisions, people do. And the difference between that is precision just means that. I mean, you're really pretending unjustifiably that there is a 1,000th difference between the way you measure. Accuracy means that the measurement method that you've had applying your operational definitions to things like what a 1 and a 5 is, do reach a reasonable determination of what the attributes of that you're measuring are. That's an accuracy thing. And one of the things we're going to play with here in the breakout is scoring definitions. And I used to use 100 until somebody asked me as a defense attorney once, well, how do you ever know what the difference is between an 82 and an 83? Some people do that. And how are they applying that? And so I've kind of evolved to a 1 through 5 definition with scoring definitions for those. And I'll show you those in a little bit before we go in to talk about it. Best value is a trade-off decision that does require that you have some reasonable way to measure the differences between the merits before you start trading off price for that. And without a common definition of kind of what you're doing on your scoring 1 through 5, it's kind of hard then to say, well, we're willing to pay, $500,000 for this because it's best value if you don't really have any definitions to help you assess what the evaluations mean in terms of the merits of the proposal. And what's the utility then? And I've got a couple, I believe they are. I mean, I'll just give you my opinion on this. We had a cooperative procurement with the state of Utah in 2001 when they were first starting to bring on e-procurement systems that they called self-funded. And we had 24 evaluators, and they represented finance, IT, and procurement and users, and from 2 states. And there was just no way we could do this and manage it without some kind of a way to give people a guideline in terms of how to do the original evaluation. And so we used a numerical evaluation system. I think they are useful. Some people don't use them at all. And I think on simpler ones where you've got 3 people that have worked together and can come to a decision on what the best value, what's most advantageous to the entity that you have, I think you don't need numbers. And so there's a range of practices in between that. So a little bit you should know about errors in decision making, though, that some evaluation techniques, numerical ones, help. And this isn't entirely about decision theory, but you know what? If a measurement is intended to measure attributes to help assist in decisions, then you need to understand some of the errors. And I'll give you some examples. The halo horns effect. Have you ever been blown away by the quality of the sales presentation in an RFP and the orals? That's why we do orals after the initial evaluation, because some people are great on their feet, but they may not even be involved in the project delivery, and they sort of kind of poison the atmosphere in terms of they're so great, it just affects how you feel about the proposal. That's the same thing with really, really glossy, wonderful proposal presentations that when you open it up, it looks, wow, this is terrific. And then you really read it, there's not much to it. Variation in evaluator certainty. We've got some people that really aren't that good on certain types of things, and yet they're on evaluation committees. Others are more strong, and we don't have any numerical ways to make that adjustment. People have to talk. People have to be able to say in a meeting, you know what, I rated them lower, but I got to tell you, I've listened to you talk about this. I'm with you. I think you have more experience with this. That's an evaluator certainty variation that sometimes these tools I'm going to show you can help. When we forecast the possibility of successful performance because of past experience and good resumes, we don't have what's known as base rates. There's a gentleman called Daniel Kahneman who has done some great writing on this in terms of errors and decisions where, the stock market has lots of base rates when they're trying to evaluate and forecast the industry movement and what stocks are going to do. We don't have that in procurement. We're guessing in large measure using our professional judgments, and we just don't have that. That's why it's important to have dialogue among people on committees. Groupthink. if you don't have numbers, and if I were to send 24 people into a meeting and say, tell us who's going to make the short list out of these 8 proposers, there's going to be some that have a lot of influence. You've seen this. They do all the talking. I got a problem with that. I suffer from that. And you're going to have some that are very capable, that have great insight, that just don't talk, and they're just going to go with the flow. And that's the nice thing about using numerical evaluations on at least the initial evaluation in applying standards, is everybody gets a peek. And we've already talked about the issue of false precision. So I'm going to just show you a couple examples of things here to give you a sense for what this is. Here is a RFP that I ran for the Department of Law and a timekeeping and case management system. If I just paused here and asked you, so tell me, what do you think about the top 2 proposers? If you can answer that for me, you're better than I, right? But if you add in a tool that we're going to play with just a little called conditional formatting, and I don't know if you've ever seen this, that does color coding based on the numerical amounts. Now you start to be able to look at visually how people feel about certain suppliers, and they're able to talk. And from this, we knew that there's probably maybe 3 on here that we want to talk in some detail about. For sure, vendor D and E, because they're the ones that really had the most blue, which was the outstanding. But even better, what it does is we would set up the evaluation spreadsheet. So we were able to then also see the comparative evaluator ratings for these different suppliers. And you could see here that I was able to then facilitate this. I wasn't I wasn't a voting member. I had attorneys, finance and case management paralegals really on the committee looking at this IT system that was going to help the Attorney General's office. But I was able to go to them and say, listen, we do know that vendor E was high up, but I am curious. I see that there's a big difference between, let's say, evaluator 2 and evaluator 7. Talk about it. What was it that you saw 2? What was it you saw 7? And sometimes after you go through this with evaluators in a that kind of discussion, sometimes they'll come back and say, you know, I think I'd like a chance to rescore. And sometimes we do that. There are some places that toss this out after the initial round, after they do the first discussion, and don't actually use the evaluation spreadsheet for the final evaluation after proposal revisions and orals if they do it. But we actually invited people, and we had people say, yeah, I'd like to, you know what, I'd like to change it. We did ask that they annotate a little bit so they could remember what it was that they changed on it. But it's a great tool called additional formatting. We're going to have 2 breakout rooms, just like you did before, but I'm not going to randomly assign them. And I'm going to give you a choice. You can either go to the breakout room 1, which is going to be, it's going to be labeled surveys. And I've given you a sample survey question here. And I'd like you to look at it and just be critical about, what do you think would be a possible objection to this in terms of a question and that you might use on a survey. Now, and then breakout room 2 is going to be numerical valuations. And what I've given you is the spreadsheet for the relative scoring of those suppliers. And I'm asking you an interesting question, and that is, could you justify award to other than the highest proposer? What do you think? The highest one got 443, the next one got 446.57 and 445.42. If you're talking as an evaluation committee, could you award to somebody that has got higher scoring on something like this? These to me are the essential behaviors of people that are working on teams. And when you're looking at evaluations, there are opportunities for you, even if you're not the head of an office, to try to help the team keep the purpose in mind, like the purpose of measurement, and using structure to kind of help organize thinking and action. That's the part about coming up with whatever your evaluation technique is, something that's organized. Measurement is useful if it helps you with decisions, and I think that that probably is one of the key takeaways, is that find measures that actually help you with decisions, or help your superiors with decisions, or your agency with decisions. So Paul, I want to thank you for the contribution. You've done great work. Yeah,
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm glad to be able to
Yeah.
participate.
Yeah, thank you very much.